Everyone trusted him. That trust is exactly how the crimes lasted so long. For years, this man stood at the pulpit and spoke about forgiveness. What no one knew was what he was hiding. For nearly 4 decades, Mike Bickle was seen as a spiritual authority in modern evangelical Christianity. He was not a fringe preacher or a hidden figure operating on the margins. He was the founder of the International House of Prayer, IHOPKC, a globally influential ministry known for its 24/7 prayer movement, worship music, and conferences that attracted tens of thousands from around the world. 2 followers. Bickle was a prophet. To the institution he built, he was untouchable. And for years, allegations against him were buried beneath loyalty, fear, and silence. IHOPKC was founded in 1999 in Kansas City, but Bickle's influence stretched back to the 1980s. He was associated with charismatic renewal movements and claimed prophetic insight. Messages, he said, came directly from God. His teachings emphasized submission to spiritual authority, obedience, and endurance through suffering. That framework mattered. In environments where leaders are believed to speak for God, questioning them feels like rebellion against faith itself. Victims do not just fear social consequences, they fear spiritual ones. The allegations against Mike Bickle did not begin recently. According to multiple verified reports, concerns about his behavior toward women existed as early as the 1980s and 1990s. Women described inappropriate conduct, grooming behaviors, and abuse of spiritual authority. Some alleged sexual misconduct, others described coercive relationships framed as spiritual mentoring. These concerns were known. If you follow real stories where faith and power collide, this channel is for you. Former leaders and insiders later confirmed that complaints had been raised internally over the years. Instead of being investigated transparently or reported to authorities, the response followed a familiar path: quiet handling, minimization, and protection of the leader. Bickle remained in power. IHOPKC grew into a global brand. Conferences expanded. Worship music reached millions. Young people from around the world moved to Kansas City to attend ministry schools, often living communally and placing their trust entirely in leadership structures. That proximity created vulnerability. Several women later described how Bickle used his spiritual status to blur boundaries. Private meetings were framed as counseling or prophetic guidance. Authority replaced consent. The imbalance of power made resistance difficult and disclosure risky. For years, those who spoke were discouraged. Some were told they had misunderstood spiritual intimacy. Others were warned not to cause division. The priority was unity, even if it required silence. The situation changed in 2023. Multiple survivors came forward publicly, supported by corroborating testimonies and documentation. Independent Christian watchdog organizations confirmed that allegations against Bickle were credible and long-standing. The response could no longer be contained. IHOPKC announced that Mike Bickle was removed from leadership. Shortly after, the ministry publicly acknowledged that it had mishandled past allegations and failed to act decisively when concerns were first raised. For many, this admission came decades too late. As details emerged, a pattern became clear. Repeated opportunities to intervene had been ignored. Loyalty to the founder outweighed protection of the vulnerable. Spiritual language had been used to deflect accountability. Law enforcement involvement became a subject of public debate. Survivors spoke openly about the difficulty of coming forward after so much time had passed. And after years of being conditioned to believe silence was obedience, the fallout was severe. IHOPKC shut down major operations. Events were cancelled. Former leaders resigned. The prayer movement that had defined the ministry collapsed almost overnight. Survivors described complex trauma, not only from alleged abuse, but from the loss of community, faith, and identity. Many had built their entire lives around the ministry. Speaking out meant losing everything. What made this case uniquely modern was not the abuse, but the timeline. This happened in an era of safeguarding policies, public awareness, and documented accountability frameworks. And still, institutional protection prevailed. The reflection is deeply unsettling. Mike Bickle was not shielded by ancient secrecy or lack of knowledge. He was shielded by reverence, fear of scandal, and the belief that exposing a leader would damage God's work. But when institutions treat leaders as indispensable, victims become disposable. The crimes were not buried because they were unknown. They were buried because confronting them threatened power, identity, and legacy. And when truth finally surfaced, it did not just expose one man, it exposed a system that taught silence as faith and endurance as virtue. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Geronimo, Pastor G. Aguilar, rose to fame in Richmond, Virginia, as the dynamic streetwise founder of the Richmond Outreach Center, widely known as the ROC. What began as a small, gritty church designed to help addicts, and struggling families grew into one of the most influential megachurches in the region. Aguilar's message was simple: redemption is possible for anyone, no matter their past. For years, thousands believed him. They believed the man who preached about second chances, about moral rebirth, about walking away from sin through the power of faith. But as investigators would eventually uncover, Aguilar was not the man he claimed to be. Behind the sermons, the community outreach programs, the televised services, and the seemingly endless acts of charity lay a devastating secret, one that would tear apart not just his ministry, but the faith of countless people who had once looked to him as a spiritual savior. Aguilar, born in California, had grown up in an environment filled with instability and violence. His early years were marked by poverty, turbulent relationships, and exposure to gang culture. He often shared these details publicly from the pulpit, shaping the narrative of a broken man saved by God. People loved that authenticity. They loved his energy, his humility, and his determination to pull others out of the same darkness he claimed to have escaped. He started the Richmond Outreach Center in the 1990s, focusing heavily on street evangelism and outreach to vulnerable populations. His ministry style was raw and unpolished, but this was precisely what made him stand out. He didn't dress like a traditional pastor. He didn't use theological jargon. He didn't distance himself from people in pain. He was accessible, relatable, and electrifying. Under his leadership, the ROC exploded in size. The church purchased buses to pick up the homeless for services. They ran recovery programs, housing initiatives, prison ministries, food banks, and youth outreach. Donations poured in, volunteers multiplied, and Pastor G became something of a local celebrity. His congregation adored him, praising him as a spiritual warrior who lived on the front lines of urban ministry. But while his public persona glowed with righteousness, Aguilar harbored secrets no one could have imagined. These secrets dated back decades, long before the ROC, stretching into his early adulthood in Fort Worth, Texas. For years, allegations lingered quietly in distant court records, barely noticed by the public. These records accused Aguilar of engaging in sexual misconduct with minor girls, acts that investigators later revealed involved manipulation, coercion, and exploitation of young victims who trusted him. Despite these allegations, Aguilar managed to move across states and continue building churches, partly because the cases were old, partly because victims struggled to come forward, and partly because Aguilar's charisma allowed him to evade scrutiny. But things changed in 2013. Two women, sisters, finally stepped forward publicly. Their accusations were clear. Aguilar had sexually abused them repeatedly when they were minors, back when he lived in Texas and served in ministry roles. Their stories were not vague. They contained details of grooming, manipulation, and the exploitation of his position as a spiritual leader. This time, the authorities listened. The Richmond community was stunned when detectives arrived at the ROC with warrants. Church members had no idea their beloved pastor had a past filled with hidden accusations. Some refused to believe it. Others felt a sudden collapse of trust, a sense that something had always felt off, but they could never explain why. As the investigation unfolded, more disturbing patterns emerged. Trips Aguilar had taken with young girls, inappropriate boundaries, evidence pointing to long-term predatory behavior. It became clear that the man who preached salvation had spent years perpetrating the very sins he condemned from the pulpit. In May 2013, Aguilar was arrested and extradited to Texas. The charges included aggravated sexual assault of a child and indecency with a minor, crimes that carried serious prison sentences. His bond was set high, and even before his trial began, the board of the ROC announced his resignation. Once the announcement made national headlines, supporters and critics alike were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had placed immense trust in a man who had exploited the power of faith. The trial was harrowing. Victims testified about how Aguilar used spiritual authority and emotional manipulation to commit acts that would haunt them for life. Prosecutors outlined a pattern of behavior that began long before Aguilar became a megachurch leader. Behavior he never truly abandoned. In 2015, Aguilar was convicted. He received a 40-year prison sentence, effectively ending his career, tearing apart the Richmond Outreach Center and sending shockwaves through the evangelical world. The aftermath was devastating. The ROC struggled to survive the scandal. Donations dried up, membership plummeted. The once vibrant, bustling megachurch became a symbol of betrayal. The people who had found sobriety, community, and purpose through the ministry felt abandoned, disillusioned, and humiliated. Many questioned their faith, wondering how God could allow such a man to rise to power. Former staff came forward with stories of controlling behavior, emotional intimidation, and authoritarian leadership. Some admitted they had seen red flags, but feared questioning a man so revered. Others regretted defending him instinctively before the truth came out. The victims, meanwhile, faced an uphill battle toward healing. Their bravery in coming forward inspired reforms in other churches and ministries, where boards began taking allegations more seriously, implementing background checks, and adopting greater accountability measures. Pastor Geronimo Aguilar's story remains one of the most notorious examples of a charismatic Christian leader who destroyed not only his ministry, but the lives of those who trusted him most. His rise and fall reflect a painful truth about religious authority. When power goes unchecked, when charisma overshadows accountability, and when devotion blinds discernment, the most vulnerable suffer the most. In the end, Aguilar's legacy is not the thousands he led to faith, the programs he built, or the church he created. Instead, it is a lingering warning about the dangers of misplaced trust, unchecked pastoral power, and the darkness that can hide behind the brightest lights of religious leadership. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. The story of Jim Bakker is one of the most infamous examples of a preacher who promised divine blessings but delivered betrayal, manipulation, and financial devastation to thousands who trusted him. It begins in an era when American televangelism was exploding across television screens, reshaping the meaning of ministry, wealth, and faith. To many, he was a warm, smiling voice of comfort. To others, he would later become the face of unchecked greed, corruption, and moral collapse. His rise was unlike anything that had been seen before. Together with his then-wife, Tammy Faye Bakker, he built a media empire that stretched across television networks, merchandise, theme parks, and massive fundraising operations that operated on a simple promise: give generously, and God would give back greater blessings. For millions of viewers, this message felt empowering, hopeful, and spiritually affirming. But behind the cameras, behind the smiling hosts, a different machine was running, one built not on faith, but on financial desperation, mismanagement, and deliberate manipulation of the very donors whose trust sustained their empire. Years before the scandal that would rock the ministry, Jim and Tammy Bakker had risen from small-town Christian entertainers to global religious celebrities. Their program, the PTL Club, felt like a blend of worship service, talk show, and telethon. Congregants would tune in live, experiencing a sense of community from across the country. For the lonely, the sick, the elderly, and the spiritually uncertain, the Bakkers seemed to offer something irreplaceable, a connection to God, wrapped in warmth and familiarity. But as the ministry grew, so did its appetite for money. Donations were no longer simply welcomed, they became essential. Fundraising took center stage, and Jim Bakker began developing new ways to extract more money from his viewers, while making them believe their generosity would directly influence their personal blessings, future prosperity, and spiritual standing. One of his most successful strategies was the Lifetime Partnership Program. For a hefty contribution, donors were promised access to luxury vacation suites at the PTL Retreat Center, a Christian getaway built to symbolize faith-driven prosperity. Viewers sent in checks by the tens of thousands, believing they were investing in a holy mission rather than a business scheme. But behind the scenes, the staff at PTL Ministry already knew the truth. Bakker had sold far more partnerships than the retreat could ever fulfill. It was a financial impossibility disguised as a divine opportunity. The ministry was drowning in overspending, and yet the fundraising pleas never slowed. Instead, they intensified, framed as holy battles against unseen forces trying to stop God's work. When auditors raised concerns, they were ignored. When staff members questioned the ethics, they were pushed aside. and when donors wrote letters asking why they couldn't book the suites they'd been promised, they received carefully worded excuses meant to delay suspicion. For years, the illusion held, but the downfall came not through finances at first. Instead, it began with a personal scandal. A young church secretary named Jessica Hahn came forward, revealing she had been sexually assaulted by Bakker and another pastor years earlier. Even more damning, she revealed that PTL ministry funds had been used to buy her silence. That revelation cracked the image Bakker had built. Suddenly, the smiling, soft-spoken pastor on millions of screens was seen in a very different light. As the story spread, journalists began digging deeper. A full investigation unearthed years of financial misconduct, including intentional overselling of the lifetime partnership suites, falsified accounting, and the misuse of ministry funds for personal luxury, private homes, lavish wardrobes, expensive cars, and extravagant gifts. The numbers weren't small. They weren't accidental. They were systemic, deliberate, and sustained. Federal investigators stepped in. Donors who had believed their contributions went toward God's work now found themselves listed as victims in a massive fraud case. Many of them were elderly, living on limited incomes, who had sent in checks month after month because Bakker promised that giving to God would open doors in heaven, and sometimes, he hinted, even on earth. For them, the betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss. It was spiritual, emotional, and deeply personal. The trial that followed brought national attention. Jim Bakker faced dozens of counts of fraud, conspiracy, and mail violations. In the courtroom, his empire was dismantled piece by piece. Prosecutors presented evidence showing how donor contributions had been diverted into personal accounts, how financial statements were manipulated to hide losses, and how the partnership programs were mathematically impossible from the moment they were created. In 1989, Bakker was convicted and sentenced to prison. The sentence was severe, reflecting the scale and intentional nature of the fraud. Supporters sobbed in the courtroom as the judge spoke. While critics argued, the punishment still didn't match the damage he had caused. His wife, Tammy Faye, publicly defended him for months, but the couple eventually separated. The ministry they had built collapsed completely, leaving behind unpaid bills, devastated followers, and a legacy of scandal that reshaped public perception of televangelism. But even after the conviction, the impact of Bakker's betrayal continued spiraling outward. Many former donors reported long-term distrust in religious institutions, feeling they could no longer tell the difference between faith leaders and con artists. Others felt profound guilt, believing they had been foolish, or that their vulnerability had made them easy targets. For some families, the financial strain caused by their donations triggered years of hardship. Communities around the country began asking deeper questions about accountability in religious organizations. How much oversight should ministries have? How should churches handle donations? And most painfully, how can ordinary believers protect themselves from leaders who hide greed behind scripture? After serving several years in prison, Bakker eventually returned to televangelism, though never with the same influence. Critics argued that his comeback demonstrated how easy it is for charismatic religious figures to regain a following. Even after public disgrace, supporters insisted he had paid his debt and deserved a second chance. But no matter where people stood, one truth remained. The wounds left by his ministry were still felt by those who had believed in him the most. The story of Jim Bakker forces viewers to confront an uncomfortable question. How does faith turn into a weapon in the hands of someone who knows how to manipulate hope, guilt, and the desire for divine certainty? For many of his former followers, the hardest part wasn't losing money, it was losing trust. Trust in a leader, trust in their own judgment, and sometimes even trust in the faith they once held dear. And that is the haunting legacy of a preacher who promised blessings but delivered betrayal. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. Gerald Jerry Sherwood was not the kind of pastor most people pictured when they imagined a small-town preacher. Tall, soft-spoken, and almost disarmingly calm, he projected an air of humility that won people over instantly. In Lake County, Florida, Sherwood had gradually built a reputation as a deeply devoted man of God, a pastor who prayed with the sick, helped troubled teens, and offered support to single mothers and struggling families. His sermons emphasized compassion, community, and forgiveness. To the people who filled the folded metal chairs inside his rented storefront church, he appeared to be someone who had chosen the ministry out of love, not ambition. But behind the soft voice and warm smiles lay years of manipulation, psychological abuse, and criminal behavior that eventually unraveled in one of the most disturbing pastoral scandals in Florida's recent history. Sherwood's church began small, just a handful of families meeting in a local community hall. Over time, he cultivated an image of accessibility that drew people in. He visited congregants after work, stayed late to pray with those dealing with grief, and offered counseling sessions for children and teenagers who felt lost or misunderstood. Many parents trusted him immediately, believing he genuinely cared for their kids. For them, he was the pastor who remembered birthdays, prayed over report cards, and sat beside hospital beds during emergencies. It was this carefully built reputation that gave Sherwood access to vulnerable people, access he would later exploit in ways that shattered families and left deep trauma in its wake. The first signs that something was wrong were subtle. Some parents later recalled how Sherwood seemed to form unusually close relationships with teenage girls in the congregation. He offered counseling sessions that took place behind locked doors. He insisted on private conversations for spiritual healing. He told parents that their daughters were struggling spiritually and needed extra guidance. For a long time, no one suspected anything sinister. Sherwood had successfully conditioned his congregation to view him as a man who went above and beyond in his ministry, someone who genuinely cared for the youth in his community. But beneath the surface, Sherwood's behavior grew more predatory and manipulative. He began isolating certain girls, telling them they were chosen by God for special spiritual responsibilities. He framed obedience to him as obedience to God. His words became weapons disguised as prophecy, using scripture to justify increasingly invasive personal interactions. Survivors later described how he created emotional dependence, convincing them that only he understood their struggles and only he could guide their souls toward salvation. One teenager eventually confided in a friend about Sherwood's behavior. That friend, frightened and unsure, told her parents, but when the parents confronted Sherwood, he reacted with hurt disbelief, insisting the girl was confused, troubled, or under spiritual attack. Using his influence, he framed himself as the victim of a cruel rumor. Many congregants believed him. Some even began ostracizing the girl's family, accusing them of attempting to destroy a man of God's reputation. This reaction silenced other victims, who feared that speaking out would only bring them shame and condemnation. Sherwood's control depended on this silence and manipulating both trust and fear. However, Sherwood's facade began to crumble when a second family approached law enforcement after their daughter revealed similar abuse. Unlike the first family, these parents went straight to the authorities. Detectives began quietly interviewing families connected to the church, and slowly, more young women came forward. Each story echoed similar patterns: private meetings, spiritual manipulation, emotional grooming, and violations disguised as counseling or deliverance ministries. The consistency of the testimonies made it impossible to dismiss them as misunderstandings or exaggerations. Once investigators obtained enough evidence, they executed a search warrant on the church and Sherwood's home. Inside, they discovered journals, recorded counseling sessions, and personal correspondence that corroborated the victim's claims. The material revealed a chilling pattern. Sherwood had not simply fallen into misconduct, but had carefully constructed a system of manipulation designed to hide his predatory behavior behind religious language and pastoral authority. When Sherwood was arrested, the news devastated the community. Parents who had once praised him as a guiding light felt betrayed. Those who had defended him against the first allegations were forced to confront the fact that they had unknowingly enabled his actions. Some of the most painful moments came during the trial, when victims testified about the spiritual and emotional manipulation they endured. Many described how Sherwood used scripture to justify his actions, twisting Bible verses to imply that obedience to him was part of their religious duty. The betrayal of trust cut deeper because he had not only violated their bodies but had used their faith against them. Sherwood's attorney attempted to argue that the encounters were consensual or exaggerated, but prosecutors presented extensive evidence showing grooming, coercion, and emotional abuse. The testimonies from multiple victims painted a clear picture of a pastor who used his authority to exploit the vulnerable. Ultimately, Sherwood was convicted on multiple counts, including sexual battery, exploitation of a minor, and child molestation. He was sentenced to decades in prison, ensuring he would never again hold a position of authority over young people. For the survivors, healing would take years. Many struggled with guilt, shame, confusion, and loss of faith. Some found it difficult to trust any spiritual leaders again. Parents grappled with regret for having trusted Sherwood so deeply. The emotional aftermath extended far beyond the courtroom. The community was forced to redefine itself in the wake of the scandal. The church dissolved, families moved away, and friendships fractured under the weight of betrayal. Experts later examined Sherwood's case as an example of how religious authority can be weaponized to groom and control victims. His calm demeanor and spiritual language masked a deliberate pattern of manipulation that exploited emotional vulnerability. The case highlighted the need for oversight in small independent churches, many of which operate without denominational accountability or external supervision. Sherwood's story remains a deeply unsettling reminder of how easily trust can be manipulated. When religious authority goes unchecked, a man who once preached about purity and spiritual protection had used the very foundations of faith to deceive and violate the people he was supposed to shepherd. His legacy is not one of spiritual leadership, but of profound exploitation. A pastor who traded his calling for control, and in doing so, shattered the lives of those who believed in him. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Tony Alemo was born Bernie Lazar Hoffman in 1934 in Joplin, Missouri, a small town that never predicted the rise of a man who would one day command a religious empire, control thousands of followers, and eventually fall in one of the darkest pastor scandals in American history. His early life was shaped by poverty, instability, and an almost singular obsession with fame. From a young age, he sought the spotlight, pursuing a career in Hollywood as a singer and promoter. But when fame never materialized, he pivoted toward something more powerful: religion. By the mid-1960s, the counterculture movement in California provided fertile ground for charismatic preachers promising salvation. With sweeping rhetoric, fiery sermons, and a penetrating stare that many described as hypnotic, Tony Alemo began recruiting lost youth, runaways, addicts, and people desperate for meaning. His message centered on repentance, divine judgment, and an apocalyptic vision of the future. These ingredients gave birth to what would become the Tony and Susan Alemo Christian Foundation, named after Tony and his wife, Susan Alemo. Their ministry began in Hollywood, where they ran communal homes filled with tightly controlled followers. Tony's sermons blended end times prophecy, strict moral rules, authoritarian control, and promises of divine protection. As the ministry grew, so did Tony's sense of power. He enforced a rigid lifestyle on his followers. No dating, no music, no fashion choices without permission, no independent thought. He demanded complete obedience, claiming that he alone knew God's truth and that the world outside was poisoned by sin. Susan Alemo, Tony's wife, brought a different side to the ministry. She had an empathetic charisma that made her a comforting presence to new recruits. Together, they became a four-stone as the fire, Susan as the warmth. Their message was simple: follow us, and God will save you. Resist us, and God will punish you. The couple expanded their operations into rural Arkansas, building large compounds where followers lived, worked, and worshipped. Tony implemented labor systems that critics later described as forced labor. Followers worked in businesses owned by the Alemos for no wages, believing their efforts were offerings to God. These operations included construction companies, clothing manufacturing, print shops, and dozens of service industries supporting the Alemos' growing wealth. But while the Alemos presented themselves as humble prophets, their lifestyle told a different story. They lived in luxury custom suits, expensive jewelry, extravagant homes, while their followers lived in austere dormitories, often surviving on minimal food and working long hours under harsh conditions. Tony taught that material wealth was a blessing from God, but only for those chosen by him conveniently. That included himself. The first major shift came in 1982, when Susan Alemo died of cancer. Her death cracked the facade of the ministry's stability. Followers were told she wasn't truly dead, only temporarily unavailable, and that she would rise again. For months, her body was kept in the compound, preserved through freezing and chemical treatment, as Tony insisted resurrection was imminent. Followers stood guard by the coffin, praying for the miracle Tony promised. When Susan did not rise, Tony's behavior grew even more extreme. He declared himself the sole prophet of the ministry and began implementing increasingly bizarre and authoritarian rules. His sermons became darker, filled with threats of damnation, divine wrath, and predictions of imminent apocalypse. Former followers later recounted that Tony used fear as his primary weapon: fear of hell, fear of punishment, fear of spiritual abandonment. Reports began to surface of severe beatings in the compound. Children were disciplined with wooden boards, adults were humiliated, isolated, or denied food for perceived disobedience. Critics said Tony fostered a climate of terror where followers were afraid to speak, behave, or even think outside his will. He told them that leaving the ministry meant eternal damnation. As authorities began investigating labor violations, tax fraud, and child mistreatment, Tony became increasingly paranoid. He moved followers across state lines, hid children from state agencies, and fortified his properties. Despite mounting scrutiny, he retained devoted supporters, many of whom believed he was being persecuted for preaching God's truth. The true horror of Tony Alamo's legacy emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Former members came forward detailing child abuse, forced marriages, and sexual exploitation, all orchestrated by Tony under the guise of religious doctrine. Testimony revealed that Tony used scripture to justify taking multiple underage girls as wives, claiming it was part of God's plan. He forced families to surrender daughters, warning them that resistance meant divine punishment. The girls were groomed, psychologically manipulated, and isolated. Tony told them they were chosen by God, and that their obedience was a holy duty. Survivors described years of trauma rapes framed as spiritual unions, physical punishments for disobedience, and threats that their families would be cast out or damned if they resisted. Federal investigators built a case, interviewing dozens of victims. They tracked financial fraud, forced labor networks, and transportation of minors across state lines for sexual purposes. The evidence was overwhelming, not only of the abuse itself, but of the intentional structure Tony created to hide his actions. Followers were taught never to speak to outsiders, never to question Tony, and always to obey in silence. In 2008, Tony Alamo was arrested and charged with sexual exploitation of minors, transportation of minors for illicit purposes, and federal child abuse violations. The trial included harrowing testimony from victims who had suffered under his control for years. They described manipulation, threats of hell, severe beatings, and being forced into sexual relationships with the pastor who claimed divine authority. Tony's defense attempted to argue that the relationships were consensual, that the accusations were part of a government conspiracy, and that the girls' families supported the marriages. But evidence showed these so-called marriages were built on coercion, manipulation, and intimidation. Many of the victims were underage, some as young as 8 or 12 when the abuse began. In 2009, Tony Alamo was sentenced to 175 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. The judge delivered a scathing statement, condemning the pastor for exploiting faith, abusing power, and destroying lives. Survivors wept as the verdict was read, many experiencing justice for the first time after years of silence. Following the conviction, the federal government seized church properties, dissolved parts of the Alamo Empire, and assisted survivors with relocation and recovery services. Former followers described the emotional devastation of realizing that the man they believed was a prophet had been a predator. Many struggled to rebuild their lives after decades inside a closed religious system that discouraged education, independence, or outside contact. Tony Alamo remained unrepentant until his death in 2017, claiming persecution and insisting he was chosen by God. But his death did little to erase the trauma he inflicted. His victims, now adults, continued fighting for recognition, reparations, and healing. Advocacy groups highlighted his case as one of the most extreme examples of pastoral abuse in American history, a reminder of how easily religious authority can be twisted into a tool of domination. The story of Tony Alamo reveals the dangerous intersection of charisma, unchecked power, and religious isolation. His ability to manipulate scripture allowed him to build a system where exploitation was justified as divine will, obedience was demanded as holy duty, and suffering was framed as spiritual purification. People joined, seeking hope, and found instead a prison of control, fear, and violence. Communities and experts have since studied the Alamo ministry to understand how such an environment forms. The consensus, when a leader claims exclusive access to God's will, discourages outside influence, and demands absolute authority, vulnerability transforms into captivity. The tragedy of Tony Alamo is not only what he did, but how he convinced so many that his actions were righteous. Even today, survivors speak at conferences, warning others to recognize the signs of spiritual manipulation. They discuss the long-term effects, PTSD, anxiety, fear of religious institutions, and struggles with trust. Their strength, resilience, and willingness to expose their suffering have become a testament to courage and a reminder that silence enables abuse. Tony Alamo built his empire with scripture in one hand and control in the other. But the truth eventually shattered the illusion. His story endures as a lesson that faith, when weaponized, becomes a tool of bondage, and that no sermon, no prophecy, and no claim of divine authority excuses the exploitation of the innocent. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor George Gibney was not always a man of the cloth. Before he ever stepped into a church pulpit, he was known across Ireland as one of the nation's most celebrated swimming coaches, a man entrusted with shaping young athletes, guiding hopeful teenagers toward Olympic dreams, and representing Ireland on the international stage. Born in Dublin in 1947, Gibney exuded charisma, discipline, and an authoritative presence that made parents feel safe entrusting their children to him. Yet behind the whistle, the stopwatch, and the gentle reassurance of mentorship lay a darkness that remained concealed for decades. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, Gibney trained some of Ireland's top swimmers, earning national praise and public admiration. But beneath the surface, swimmers, most of them minors, were enduring abuse that would not be fully revealed until years later. Gibney used his position of authority to control, manipulate, and terrify his victims, often under the guise of strict coaching discipline or personal development. He isolated favorite swimmers, demanded loyalty, and fostered a climate of intimidation. For those under his guidance, questioning him was unthinkable. For parents, the idea that a respected coach could be abusive seemed almost impossible. Everything changed in the early 1990s, when several former swimmers courageously came forward with allegations of sexual abuse. The accusations described patterns of predatory behavior, forced encounters during training trips, abuse disguised as performance evaluations, and emotional manipulation designed to silence victims. In 1993, the Irish state began investigating these claims, ultimately bringing charges against him. But what unfolded next shocked the public, frustrated victims, and exposed critical flaws in the justice system. Gibney's legal team exploited a procedural loophole in Irish law, arguing that the significant delay between the alleged offences and prosecution made it impossible for him to defend himself. In a controversial ruling, the Irish Supreme Court agreed. The indictment was quashed, and the case collapsed, not because the allegations lacked credibility, but because the court believed he could not receive a fair trial due to the time that had passed. For survivors, the ruling was devastating. The legal system they trusted had allowed the man they accused to walk free. Public outcry followed, as the decision was seen as an example of procedural technicality overshadowing justice. Calls for reform echoed across Ireland, but for Gibney, the ruling provided more than acquittal. It gave him freedom, anonymity, and the opportunity to rebuild his life far from the accusations. Instead of remaining in Ireland, Gibney disappeared. In the mid-90s, he quietly immigrated to the United States with assistance from connections within religious and athletic networks. There, he reinvented himself not as a coach, but as a pastor and church volunteer, inserting himself into new communities where people had no knowledge of his past. In places like Colorado, California, and eventually Florida, he blended into church life, sometimes taking roles related to youth involvement, community prayer, or counseling. His reinvention succeeded largely because American churches and institutions had no access to his sealed Irish case file, and background checks revealed nothing. For nearly 2 decades, Gibney lived quietly in American suburbs, attending church regularly, joining Bible study groups, and positioning himself as a man of faith, seeking spiritual service. For survivors back home in Ireland, his disappearance felt like a knife wound reopened every day, a reminder that a man accused by multiple victims could simply slip into another life and evade consequences. Victims and advocates began pressing governments, journalists, and law enforcement agencies to track him down. Their efforts paid off in 2015, when an investigative team uncovered that Gibney was living in Florida and active in local church circles. The revelation triggered outrage in both Ireland and the United States. Journalists confronted him in parking lots. Activist groups protested near his residence, and survivors publicly demanded justice. The situation intensified when immigration authorities began reviewing whether he had been granted entry to the U.S. under false pretenses. Under pressure, the U.S. launched a federal investigation into how he was admitted into the country, and whether his past should disqualify him from residency. Meanwhile, in Ireland, the sports community grappled with the painful reality that one of their most prominent coaches had allegedly inflicted trauma on young swimmers for years. The revelation prompted new national child protection laws, overhauls in sports oversight, and greater transparency in youth athletic programs across the country. For victims, the reforms were important, but they did not erase decades of pain. As details of Gibney's past became more widely known, American communities that had once embraced him began to recognize the risks he posed. Churches that had welcomed him quietly distanced themselves. Members expressed shock and betrayal, and parents who had interacted with him questioned how someone with such a history could have been allowed near youth programs. To many, it felt like a chilling example of how charisma and religious involvement can be used to conceal disturbing truths. Despite international pressure, multiple investigations, and extensive media scrutiny, Gibney has never faced criminal conviction for the allegations made against him. Legal barriers, jurisdiction issues, and timing have shielded him from prosecution. Yet the absence of a conviction has not silenced victim testimonies, nor diminished the weight of their stories. They have spoken publicly, sometimes on national television, sometimes through private interviews, with courage and clarity, ensuring that the truth of their experiences could no longer be hidden. Survivor advocacy groups in Ireland and the US have used Gibney's case as a rallying cry to reform how institutions handle sexual abuse allegations, emphasizing the need for accountability, mandatory reporting, and cross-border cooperation. His case also sparked intense debates about how individuals accused of serious crimes can exploit religious institutions to establish new identities and avoid detection. It illustrated the dangers of assuming that religious involvement equates to moral integrity, and highlighted the weaknesses of systems that fail to track higher-risk individuals across borders. Gibney's life in Florida has become increasingly isolated as public awareness of his past grows. Neighbors who once saw him as a quiet retiree now view him with suspicion. Community members who prayed alongside him express feelings of betrayal. For survivors, this exposure does not erase trauma, but it represents a form of moral justice and acknowledgement that despite escaping legal consequences, he cannot hide from the truth. The story of Pastor George Gibney is a chilling example of how authority, trust, and religious involvement can mask a past filled with harm. It reveals how abusers can exploit institutional gaps to avoid accountability, and how communities can be manipulated by individuals who craft new identities behind the facade of spiritual devotion. For survivors, the battle for justice continues not through courtrooms, but through speaking out, demanding transparency, and ensuring the world remembers what happened. Gibney's case exposes a difficult but necessary truth. Predators often seek roles that allow access to the vulnerable, and without vigilance, oversight, and a willingness to question even the most respected figures, history can repeat itself. His story is both a warning and a call for reform across sports, churches, and all institutions that shape the lives of young people. While he may have evaded prison, the legacy of his actions continues to echo through the voices of those he harmed, reminding the world that truth has a way of resurfacing, even decades after the crimes were committed. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Before the world knew the name R. Kelly as a global R&B superstar whose crimes would later shock the world, he was first known in his community as Pastor Robert Sylvester Kelly, a church-trained gospel musician raised under the spiritual authority of pastors who encouraged him, mentored him, and placed him behind the pulpit as a young performer. Though Kelly was never ordained in a formal sense, he carried the title pastor and minister of music throughout his youth, leading choirs, performing sermons, and guiding worship at churches across Chicago's South Side. To many, he was a young man touched by God, someone whose talent came directly from heaven. But decades later, the public would learn that behind the music, behind the church upbringing, and behind the praise from clergy, Kelly had become one of the most notorious predators in modern American history. a man who used his spiritual reputation and community trust to hide escalating patterns of sexual abuse, manipulation, and psychological control. Robert Sylvester Kelly was born in 1967 in Chicago, Illinois, and from an early age, the church became the center of his life. His mother, Joanne Kelly, brought him to services every week. He sang in the choir, played piano during worship, helped with youth services, and delivered music that moved congregants to tears. Church leaders quickly saw his talent. They called him blessed, anointed, chosen. They placed him in leadership positions that gave him spiritual authority despite his young age. Church members remembered him as a spoken, polite young man whose voice seemed capable of lifting a congregation into emotional catharsis. But beneath that carefully cultivated church image, darker truths were forming. Kelly would later reveal in interviews, and victims would corroborate, that he endured sexual abuse as a child within the same religious community that had elevated him. Family acquaintances, older church members, and individuals with authority were later identified as potential abusers. Traumatic experiences at such a young age had lasting psychological consequences, but trauma alone cannot explain the monstrous behaviors Kelly would later inflict. It only provides context for his growing detachment from moral boundaries. By his teenage years, Kelly had developed a double life. In church, he was a respected musician. Outside, he used his position to attract young girls who admired him. Multiple former congregants would later reveal that Kelly frequently spent time with teenage girls after choir rehearsals or youth events. Some adults claimed to have confronted him. Others ignored what they saw, most simply assumed the behavior was harmless. A tragic hesitation that would allow his predatory pattern to grow unchecked for decades. Kelly transitioned into mainstream music in the late 1980s, forming a group with church peers before eventually signing with Jive Records. His rise to fame was rapid. Hits like I Believe I Can Fly and Gotham City made him an international icon, and his gospel-inspired delivery strengthened the perception that he was a spiritually guided artist. Fans adored him. Churches invited him to speak. Youth pastors cited him as proof that God rewards perseverance. Kelly leaned heavily into this narrative, often crediting his success to God and sharing stories about how faith shaped his life. All the while, behind closed doors, his predatory behavior escalated. By the early 1990s, multiple young women and girls were already reporting inappropriate behavior. Some described being approached backstage at concerts. Others recalled being contacted by Kelly's associates, individuals who acted as recruiters, offering young girls opportunities to sing, model, or receive spiritual mentorship. Many of these victims came from religious families who believed Kelly's persona as a faith-driven musician. To them, he wasn't just a celebrity, he was a pastor's child, a church-trained man, a gospel-rooted figure who spoke openly about God. One of the earliest public cracks in Kelly's image came in 1994, when he illegally married 15-year-old Olia, one of his protégés, at a Chicago ceremony. Kelly presented himself as her musical mentor and spiritual guide. To outsiders, he claimed he was helping a talented young woman find her voice. Behind the scenes, he manipulated, coerced, and controlled her life. The marriage, later annulled, was facilitated through falsified documents that listed Olia as 18. Church members who had once praised Kelly began whispering. Some knew something was wrong, but in a culture where celebrity status and spiritual reputation shielded men from accountability, few spoke publicly. Over the next 2 decades, allegations piled up like a dam ready to burst. Videos, photos, testimony, and lawsuits revealed patterns of abuse involving minors, coercion, confinement, and sexual exploitation. Victims described how Kelly used his spiritual roots to manipulate them. He told them God brought them to him. He told them they were chosen. He told them leaving him meant betraying God's plan. This spiritual language, borrowed from his pastoral upbringing, became a weapon. Many survivors were teenagers when they met him. Some were recruited at malls. Others were approached outside concerts. Several met him through church connections, people who praised Kelly as a man of God. His team often targeted girls who admired him for his gospel music or believed he would guide them spiritually. Once inside his inner circle, the victims described a system of psychological domination, strict rules for how they dressed, restrictions on communication, isolation from families, punishment for disobedience, public humiliation, sexual coercion framed as spiritual obedience. Kelly turned religious language into a tool of control. and created an environment that resembled a cult more than a music career. By the 2000s, the allegations became national news. The infamous videotape showing Kelly engaging in acts with an underage girl surfaced, yet despite overwhelming evidence, Kelly was acquitted in 2008 due to witness intimidation, fear, and legal loopholes. Many church leaders remained silent. Some even defended him, citing forgiveness, redemption, and the belief that only God could judge. But victims kept coming forward. In the late 2010s, documentaries like Surviving R. Kelly amplified survivors' voices. Public outrage grew. Prosecutors revisited old cases. New victims emerged. And in 2021, the dam finally broke. Kelly was convicted on federal charges, including racketeering, sex trafficking, coercion, and abuse. The verdict exposed a decades-long system of exploitation that had been protected by fame, money, and the lingering perception that Kelly was a God-touched figure rather than a predator. The courtroom testimonies painted a devastating picture. Young women deprived of autonomy, manipulated emotionally and spiritually, and trapped in environments where Kelly dictated every aspect of their lives. Many described long-lasting trauma, anxiety, depression, loss of trust in religious institutions, and deep spiritual wounds. They spoke about how Kelly used his church background to gain parents' trust, sometimes even interacting with families as though he were a spiritual mentor. Kelly was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, marking one of the most significant convictions of a public figure for long-term sexual violence in modern U.S. history. Prosecutors emphasized that the crimes weren't spontaneous, they were organized, calculated, and facilitated by a network of enablers who protected Kelly's image. The aftermath left deep scars on communities, especially African American church communities that had celebrated his music for decades. Many pastors issued statements of condemnation. Some admitted they had once defended him out of ignorance. Others struggled with the difficult truth that a man raised by the church, who preached in youth services, and who used religious language throughout his career, had used that same influence to prey on the vulnerable. Victims were left to rebuild their lives. Some turned to therapy, others found healing through activism. Several openly discussed how Kelly's manipulation fractured their sense of faith. The spiritual betrayal, they said, was sometimes worse than the abuse, because the language he used was familiar, sacred, and trusted. The reflection that emerges from Pastor Robert Sylvester Kelly's story is one of urgent warning. When a leader, religious or not, relies on charisma over accountability, and when spiritual language is used to manipulate instead of uplift, the consequences can be catastrophic. Kelly's church upbringing provided him early trust, early authority, and early access to vulnerable youth. The very institution that shaped him gave him tools he later weaponized. It is a sobering reminder that faith, without oversight, transparency, and safeguards, can be dangerously misused. Kelly's legacy is not just a celebrity scandal. It is a heartbreaking example of how spiritual grooming can operate behind the facade of music, fame, and church leadership. His story forces communities to ask difficult questions. How do we protect young people from those who hide behind religious language? How do we hold charismatic figures accountable before they harm? And how do we repair the damage when trust is broken at the spiritual level? The truth is simple and devastating. Kelly was once a preacher of hope, love, and inspiration. But behind the sermon, behind the gospel roots, and behind the polished image, he was building a private world of domination, exploitation, and terror. And for decades, no one stopped him. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Jean-Claude Roman became one of the most disturbing and complex criminal cases in European history, not because of a moment of violence alone, but because of a lifelong deception that spiraled into tragedy. Although not a traditional pastor, in the sense of leading a congregation, he repeatedly used religious identity, moral authority, and spiritual persona to deceive those around him. Roman didn't merely lie about a job, a degree, or a relationship. He fabricated an entire identity, and through that false identity, he infiltrated religious spaces, manipulated the trust of churchgoers, and ultimately committed crimes that horrified France and the world. His story became one of Europe's most infamous examples of spiritual betrayal, intertwined with long-term psychological manipulation. Born in Lons-le-Saunier, France, in 1954, Roman showed early signs of intelligence and quiet determination. His childhood was uneventful by most accounts. He grew up in a modest family, attended school, and blended into his small community. There were no early warnings of deception, manipulation, or malice. Yet, even in adolescence, Roman began to craft lies to avoid embarrassment or gain sympathy. Teachers remembered him as charming but evasive, intelligent but strangely inconsistent. These traits, subtle, almost invisible, would later escalate into elaborate, lifelong fabrications that blurred the line between fantasy and reality. After finishing high school, Roman enrolled in medical school in Lyon, but something happened during his second year. Either the pressure was too great, or his fear of failure outweighed his ambition. Instead of failing out, he simply stopped attending classes, stopped taking exams, stopped participating in the life he had presented to everyone else. But he never told his family. Instead, he began the deception that would define his life. He pretended to continue medical school, year after year, fabricating progress, exams, and internships that never happened. Over time, Roman learned something that would become his trademark skill: the ability to mimic the language, mannerisms, and emotional cues of an educated professional. He read medical journals, memorized terminology, attended public medical lectures, and cultivated an aura of calm authority. Eventually, he told family and friends he had become a successful doctor and secured a prestigious position at the World Health Organization, WHO in Geneva, one of the most trusted and respected organizations in global health. The lie worked. More than that, it flourished. Using his supposed position, Roman developed connections with religious groups and charitable organizations. He frequently discussed humanitarian work, medical missions, and global health initiatives with local church leaders. Too many, he radiated moral sincerity, a man called not just to medicine, but to service. Churches welcomed him. Pastors invited him to speak. Congregants admired him for blending scientific expertise with deep spirituality. But behind the scenes, Roman's life was collapsing under the weight of his own deception. He had no job, no salary, no office, no colleagues. He spent his days driving aimlessly, sitting in parking lots, or pacing in forests while pretending to be at work. He lived off financial support provided by his wife's family, friends, church members, and people who believed they were entrusting money to a respected doctor who also happened to be a devout, compassionate Christian. He manipulated religious trust to sustain his increasingly fragile illusion. He accepted donations meant for charity, for missions, for personal needs related to his supposed work. He played the role of the wise spiritual advisor, listening to confessions, offering prayers, and providing counsel. Many believed he was a model of Christian humility, a man dedicated to healing the world. But beneath the surface, panic was setting in. By the early 1990s, financial pressures had grown uncontrollable. People were asking questions. His wife, Florence, was pushing for clarity about finances and work. His parents were proud but confused about the details of his career. Friends were beginning to notice inconsistencies, strange behaviors, and unexplained absences. Rumors began to circulate quietly. The facade was cracking. And then, in January 1993, Roman snapped. Rather than confess the truth that he had deceived everyone for nearly 2 decades, he committed one of the most shocking family murders in modern French history. On January 9th, he murdered his wife by striking her in the head. Then he killed his children, 5-year-old Antoine and 7-year-old Caroline. After that, he drove to his parents' home and murdered both of them. He visited his ex-mistress, attempting to kill her as well, but she fought back and survived. Finally, he returned home, poured gasoline everywhere, and set the house on fire in an attempted suicide. But even that failed. Firefighters rescued him before the flames consumed him. What they didn't know, at least at first, was that they had rescued not a victim, but the perpetrator of one of the most elaborate and devastating frauds France had ever seen. When investigators arrived, the story unraveled rapidly. There were no records of Roman's medical degree, no employment history with WHO, no colleagues, no office, no salary. Years of lies spilled into the open. The church communities he had been part of were stunned. Parishioners who had trusted him felt a mixture of shock, betrayal, and horror. How could a man who prayed with them, preached with them, and presented himself as a model Christian commit such an atrocity? The case became an international sensation. Psychologists and criminologists examined his life, baffled by the scale of his deception. Some argued he was a pathological narcissist. Others believed he lived in a state of dissociation so deep he had convinced himself the lies were justified. Religious communities held vigils, prayed for the victims, and struggled to understand how faith itself had been weaponized by a man who wore it like a disguise. Roman's trial in 1996 captivated France. Prosecutors painted him as a cold, calculating manipulator. The defense described him as a mentally ill man trapped in a fantasy he could not escape. Victims' families testified through tears. Former church members expressed outrage that he had used spirituality and charity to deceive them. In the end, the jury found him guilty of multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Yet even in prison, Roman's manipulation of religious identity persisted. He became deeply involved in Catholic religious studies and prayer circles, once again portraying himself as a spiritual figure, this time among inmates. Some saw it as a genuine turn toward faith and repentance. Others saw it as another performance, a way to shield himself from the full weight of guilt. His behavior reignited debates about whether he had ever been truly spiritual, or if religion had simply been another mask. The societal impact of Roman's crimes extended far beyond the courtroom. Churches across France implemented stricter guidelines for volunteers and guest speakers. Religious leaders emphasized the importance of background checks, transparency, and accountability. The case opened a national conversation about trust, authority, and how vulnerable people can be when individuals use religious identity as a tool for manipulation. Roman's story has continued to haunt France. His release from prison in 2019 sparked renewed debate and anxiety. Many argued he should never be free. Others pointed to rehabilitation. Yet the shadow of his crimes lingers, especially among church communities who felt spiritually violated by his deception. The tragedy of Jean-Claude Roman reveals the terrifying potential of spiritual authority when twisted by deception. He embodied the image of a faithful Christian, a caring husband, a devoted father, a respected professional, a moral example while hiding a labyrinth of lies. His case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. The most dangerous betrayal comes not from strangers, but from those who claim moral virtue and spiritual purity. In the end, Roman's life is a reminder that religious identity can be used as both a shield and a weapon. He fooled congregations, friends, and his own family by cloaking himself in the language of faith. And when the illusion could no longer hold, the collapse was catastrophic. He was never the doctor he claimed to be. He was never the man of faith he pretended to be. He was a predator of trust, hiding behind prayer. The stories you've seen today expose a chilling reality. The very individuals entrusted with guiding faith, morality, and community can sometimes betray the sacred trust placed in them. From hidden sins to blatant exploitation, these preachers turned positions of spiritual authority into tools for personal gain, manipulation, and harm. Faith is meant to inspire, protect, and uplift, but when leadership is corrupted, the consequences are profound and lasting. Subscribe to continue uncovering the hidden truths behind those who wield spiritual influence. Like this video if these cases opened your eyes to the dangers of blind trust, and share to alert others to the warning signs of those who may betray their calling. Because understanding the fine line between holiness and corruption is the first step in protecting yourself, your community, and the sacred values that should guide all faith leaders.